A journalist went to investigate a building where the elevator sometimes goes to a wrong floor. She was a skeptic, until the doors opened into a twisted version of the building, and she found an old, tarnished nameplate on an apartment door, bearing her own name. The assignment smelled of mothballs and cheap sensation. Elena, whose name in journalistic circles was a synonym for corporate exposé, not urban legends, stared at the printout with a professional disgust. The cursed high-rise on the outskirts. The brief stated that residents were complaining about the elevator. Sometimes, they said, it went to the wrong floor. It was the kind of story given to interns, a piece of fluff designed to fill a page in the weekend supplement, and she felt the assignment as a personal insult to her skills and reputation. She arrived there by noon, armed with a digital recorder and a heavy dose of skepticism. The building was a dreary concrete monolith, its facade stained with years of rain and neglect, utterly indistinguishable from 100 others in the city's forgotten districts. It was a place where hope seemed to have been plastered over with cheap gray paint. She began her methodical canvassing of the residents, working her way from the top down, her knocks echoing in the quiet, musty hallways that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp. The people she spoke to were a predictable cast for such a story. There were the elderly, whose memories were as frayed as their curtains, and superstitious homemakers who spoke in hushed, conspiratorial tones, glancing nervously toward the elevator shaft at the end of the hall. Their stories were hazy, full of contradictions and second-hand accounts. One woman swore the elevator had taken her to a basement that didn't exist, while another man claimed he had seen the buttons for floors 10 and 11 briefly illuminate in the dark. But as she continued her interviews, a strange and unnerving consistency began to emerge from the fog of hearsay. Despite the different details and embellishments, nearly every story, when pressed, converged on a single, impossible point. They all spoke of the 9th floor. It was a place they mentioned with a mixture of fear and reverence, a floor that did not exist, could not exist, in this architecturally sound and thoroughly documented 8-story building. It was the one detail that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle, despite her resolute disbelief. She catalogued the rational explanations in her mind: collective psychosis, a shared delusion born of boredom and the building's oppressive atmosphere. Perhaps it was a convoluted ploy to draw attention to the structure's general state of disrepair. A faulty electrical system in the elevator could cause the indicator panel to glitch, creating phantom numbers. She had a dozen logical reasons, all of them plausible, all of them more believable than a ghost in the machine. The story wasn't supernatural, it was sociological. That would be her angle. After several hours, she had enough. She had a collection of wild, unsubstantiated claims and a few decent quotes from frightened residents. It was enough for a quirky human interest piece, a brief foray into modern folklore that would be forgotten by Monday. She felt the dull ache of a wasted afternoon, the familiar disappointment of a promising lead dissolving into nothing more than neighborhood gossip. The legend of the 9th floor was just that, a legend. A story people told themselves to make their gray, monotonous lives feel a little less ordinary. She had spent several hours in the building, and her initial skepticism had only hardened into a solid, unshakable certainty. The whole thing was a bust. To prove her point, and to add a bit of experiential color to her otherwise flimsy article, she had ridden the old, rattling elevator herself at least 10 times. She traveled from the 3rd floor to the 5th, from the 8th down to the 1st, and every combination in between. The machine performed its duties with a tired but reliable predictability. Everything worked as it should, if one didn't count the irritating, high-pitched squeal of the cables and the persistent, damp smell of mildew. She stood in the ground floor lobby, the dim, yellow light making the peeling paint on the walls look even more depressing. She had her story, or what passed for one. A few colorful quotes, a bit of atmospheric description of the building's decay, and a healthy dose of sociological analysis about the birth of modern urban legends. It was a perfectly adequate, if thoroughly uninspired, piece. She was ready to leave, to chalk the whole experience up to a collective delusion, a desperate attempt by the building's residents to make their mundane lives feel a little more interesting, a little more enchanted. But a small, professional nagging at the back of her mind stopped her. She needed one final, definitive test. A control run. One last trip from the top floor to the bottom, a final confirmation of the elevator's boring, mechanical normality. It was a needless gesture, a journalistic superstition, but she felt compelled to do it. With a sigh of resignation, she pressed the call button again. The ancient machinery groaned to life somewhere above her, and after a long, rattling journey, the metal doors scraped open, revealing the same small, claustrophobic box she had been in and out of all afternoon. She stepped inside, the doors closing behind her with a loud, metallic clang that echoed in the small space. She pressed the button for the 8th floor. The elevator shuddered, then began its slow, noisy ascent. The journey up was, as always, completely uneventful. She watched the floor numbers light up in predictable succession, each one a small, red beacon of rationality in this house of foolish stories. The elevator reached the top floor, the doors opened to the familiar, dingy hallway, and then closed again. She pressed the button for the ground floor, ready for this final, pointless ride to be over. The descent began. The elevator jolted and then started its rattling journey downward. 8th floor. 7th floor. The squeal of the cables was a familiar, grating song. She leaned against the back wall of the cab, her eyes closed, already mentally composing the opening paragraph of her article. And then, somewhere in the dark, unlabeled space between the 7th and 6th floors, the elevator stopped. It wasn't a smooth, controlled stop. It was a sudden, violent halt, a metallic scream of protest that threw her forward, forcing her to catch herself on the control panel. The cab shuddered violently for a few seconds, the sound of grinding metal a deafening roar in the confined space. Then, the single, bare light bulb overhead flickered once, twice, and then went out. The world dissolved into a perfect, absolute blackness. The roar of the machinery was replaced by a silence so profound, so complete, that she could hear the frantic, panic thumping of her own heart. She was trapped. Trapped in a metal box, suspended in the dark, in the very heart of the building she had so confidently dismissed as a collection of harmless ghost stories. She fumbled in her pocket for her phone, its familiar, rectangular shape a small, comforting anchor in the disorienting darkness. Her fingers, clumsy with a sudden surge of adrenaline, found the power button. The screen flared to life, its bright, white light a shocking, painful intrusion in the absolute black. She held it up, using it as a makeshift flashlight, the beam cutting a nervous, trembling path across the graffiti-scarred walls of the elevator. She was alone. Of course she was alone. But the feeling of being watched, a classic trope of the story she had just been listening to, was suddenly, irrationally, overwhelmingly present. She tried the buttons. The door open button, the alarm button, all the buttons for the different floors. None of them responded. They were dead, inert pieces of plastic. She was well and truly stuck. A wave of claustrophobia, an emotion she had never been particularly prone to, began to rise in her chest. The walls of the small cab seemed to be pressing in on her, the air growing thick and heavy, difficult to breathe. She took a few deep, ragged breaths, forcing herself to be calm, to be the rational, professional journalist she was. There was a logical explanation. A power outage. A mechanical failure. But the lights in the hallway, visible through the small, grimy window in the elevator door, were still on. So it wasn't a building-wide power outage. It was something specific to the elevator. A blown fuse, perhaps. She tried calling the emergency number listed on the small, faded plaque on the wall, but her phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. She was in a metal box, deep inside a concrete building. She was cut off, isolated, a single, helpless point of life in a vast, indifferent machine. The stories of the residents, which had seemed so quaint and foolish just minutes ago, now echoed in her mind with a new and terrifying resonance. And then, as she was about to give in to a full-blown panic, a low, electrical hum filled the cab. It was not the familiar, reassuring hum of a working machine. It was a deeper, more resonant sound, a strange, vibrational thrum that seemed to come from the very walls of the elevator, a sound that she could feel in her teeth. The single, bare light bulb overhead flickered back to life, but its light was different now. It was a weak, sickly, yellowish glow, a jaundiced light that made the small, enclosed space feel even more oppressive, more tomb-like. And on the panel above the door, the floor indicator, which had been dark, began to glow. The emergency light didn't come on right away. There was a long, terrifying moment of absolute blackness and silence, a sensory deprivation that seemed to stretch into an eternity. Then, with a faint, electrical crackle, a single, dim, yellowish bulb above her head sputtered to life. It was not a reassuring light. It was a sick, jaundiced glow that seemed to absorb more light than it cast, painting the scuffed, graffiti-marred walls of the cab in sickly shades of ochre and brown. It was the light of a fever dream, a light that made the small, enclosed space feel even more like a tomb. But it wasn't the quality of the light that captured Elena's attention. It was the panel above the doors, the digital floor indicator that had been her one small beacon of rationality throughout her earlier, pointless journeys. It was no longer dark. It was alive, but it was behaving erratically, as if it were having a seizure. The small, red LED segments that were supposed to form the familiar, comforting shapes of numbers were flashing in a chaotic, random sequence. They flickered and danced, creating a cascade of nonsensical, broken patterns, a frantic, silent scream in a language of pure digital gibberish. She stared at the display, mesmerized by its frantic, meaningless dance. The last vestiges of her rational, journalistic skepticism were beginning to crumble, eroded away by the sheer, undeniable strangeness of her situation. A mechanical failure could explain a power outage. It could even, perhaps, explain a stuck elevator. But it could not explain this. This was not a malfunction. This was a message. It was the machine, the building, the very fabric of this place, trying to communicate, and its language was one of pure, unadulterated madness. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaotic flickering stopped. The frantic dance of the red segments ceased, and for a moment, the display went dark. A heavy, expectant silence descended upon the cab again. Elena held her breath, her eyes locked on the dark panel, a terrible, premonitory dread coiling in the pit of her stomach. And then, the segments glowed to life again, not in a flicker, but in a steady, solid, and deeply unnerving crimson light. They did not form a number. They did not form a letter. They formed a symbol, a single, perfect, and utterly alien character. It was a spiral. A tight, inwardly coiling spiral, like the shell of a nautilus or the vortex of a whirlpool. It was a shape that was both ancient and futuristic, a symbol that seemed to hold a profound, esoteric meaning that she could feel but not comprehend. It was a symbol of infinity, of a journey inward with no end. It glowed with a steady, hypnotic pulse, and the sight of it sent a fresh wave of cold, primal fear through her, a fear that was deeper and more profound than the simple, claustrophobic panic she had felt before. This was not a mechanical failure. This was something else. This was a destination. As the spiral symbol continued its silent, rhythmic pulse, the low, vibrational hum that had filled the cab began to grow in intensity. It was no longer just a sound she could hear, it was a physical force she could feel in the soles of her feet, in her ribcage, in her very teeth. The entire elevator was resonating with this deep, subsonic frequency, a sound that felt both mechanical and organic, like the purr of some vast, unseen, and utterly alien creature. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, static energy that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. And then, with a sound that was not the familiar, metallic clang of a working elevator, but the slow, grating screech of long disused and heavily rusted metal, the doors began to open. They didn't slide open smoothly. They shuddered and scraped, parting with an agonizing slowness, as if they were being forced open against their will by some immense, unseen pressure. The gap between them widened, a sliver of darkness at first, then a growing vertical slash that revealed not the familiar, dingy hallway of the 6th or 7th floor, but something else entirely. Something new. The light from the hallway that spilled into the cab was not the weak, yellow light of the rest of the building. It was a cold, sterile, almost bluish-white light, the kind of light one finds in a hospital or a laboratory. And the air that drifted in was not the familiar, musty air of the old apartment block. It was stale, still, and carried the faint, cloying scent of old paper and something sweet and decaying, like the smell of flowers left too long in a vase. It was the scent of a place that had been sealed off from the world for a very, very long time. The doors groaned to their fully open position, revealing the hallway beyond. At a first, cursory glance, it looked similar to the other floors. A long, straight corridor, with apartment doors lining either side. But as her eyes adjusted to the new, harsh light, she began to see the differences. And the differences were profound, unsettling, and utterly, fundamentally wrong. The floor was not the cracked, dirty linoleum of the rest of the building. It was a dark, polished wood, scuffed and worn with age, but clearly of a much higher quality. The walls were not painted a depressing, institutional beige. They were covered in a dark, flocked wallpaper, a repeating pattern of faded, vaguely floral shapes that seemed to writhe and shift in her peripheral vision. She stood frozen in the doorway of the elevator, a trespasser on the threshold of an impossible place. Her mind, the sharp, analytical mind of an investigative journalist, was struggling to process the sensory data. Every instinct, every piece of her training, was screaming at her that this was not a dream, not a hallucination. The dust motes dancing in the cold, white light were too real. The smell of decay was too specific. The chill in the air was too palpable. This place, this impossible, non-existent floor, was as real as the building around it. She took a hesitant step out of the elevator, her shoes making a soft, incongruous sound on the polished wooden floor. The silence in the hallway was absolute. It was not the quiet of an empty building. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a library or a museum, the silence of a place that was meant to be observed, not inhabited. The air was cold and still, and she could feel the weight of it pressing in on her, a silent, unseen pressure that seemed to suck the very breath from her lungs. She was an intruder here, a foreign body in a sterile, self-contained, and deeply wrong ecosystem. She looked at the doors. They were made of the same dark, heavy wood as the floor, each one adorned with a small, tarnished brass nameplate. This was another detail that was wrong. The other floors had cheap, plastic numbers screwed to the doors. These were old, elegant, and bespoke. The numbers on them were the same as the apartments on the floors below, but the names were all different. They were names she had never seen before, old-fashioned, vaguely foreign names that seemed to belong to another era. And then, her eyes fell on the door at the far end of the hall. The door that corresponded to the apartment number of her own home, in a different building, in a different part of the city. And the name on that brass plate, elegantly engraved in a flowing, cursive script, was her own. Behind the doors was not an ordinary corridor. At first glance, it resembled the other floors, a long, straight hallway lined with apartment doors. But the devil, as always, was in the details, and the details here were screamingly, fundamentally wrong. The wallpaper was a dark, faded floral pattern, a repeating motif of wilting, brownish-purple flowers that seemed to writhe and squirm if she stared at them for too long. It was a pattern she had not seen on any of the other floors, a relic from a forgotten, more decadent era of interior design. The lighting was different, too. Instead of the bare, functional fluorescent tubes of the floors below, the ceiling here was adorned with a series of old-fashioned, bell-shaped glass lampshades. They were thick, milky white, and coated in a uniform, undisturbed layer of gray dust, as if they hadn't been touched or cleaned in half a century. The light they cast was a cold, sterile white, a light that seemed to bleach the color from the already faded wallpaper, giving the entire corridor the sterile, posed look of a museum exhibit. The air was heavy and stagnant, thick with the scent of old paper, decaying fabric, and a faint, cloyingly sweet smell, like flowers left to rot in a vase. It was the smell of a sealed room, a place untouched by the flow of time, a perfectly preserved pocket of the past. She took a few hesitant steps down the corridor, her modern sneakers a jarring anachronism on the dark, polished wooden floor. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Even her own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. She began to look at the nameplates on the doors. They were another jarring detail. Not the cheap, plastic numbers screwed to the flimsy doors of the other floors, but elegant, old-fashioned brass plates, tarnished with age, the names engraved in a flowing, cursive script. The apartment numbers were the same, a familiar, comforting sequence. But the names were all wrong. They were names she had never heard before, names that sounded vaguely European, names that felt as if they belonged to the cast of a black and white film from the 1940s. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She was a trespasser in a silent, forgotten world. Every detail of this place was a contradiction, a piece of a puzzle that she could not comprehend. Her rational mind was scrabbling for an explanation, for a logical framework that could contain the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of it all. A hallucination. A dream. But the chill in the air was too real, the smell of decay too specific, the solid feel of the wooden floor beneath her feet too undeniable. She continued down the hallway, her journalistic instincts, long dormant, beginning to stir amidst the fear. She was an observer, a witness to something impossible. She had to document it, to understand it. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the camera app. She had to get a picture of this, a piece of tangible evidence that would prove she wasn't going mad. But the phone's screen was black. The battery was full, but the device was completely dead, a sleek, useless brick in her hand. The technology of her world had no power here. She reached the end of the corridor, her eyes drawn to the final door on the left. The number on the brass plate was 36. The same number as her own apartment, in her own building, miles away from this cursed, forgotten place. And the name engraved on the tarnished brass, the name that made the breath catch in her throat and the blood freeze in her veins, was her own. Elena Petrova. It was her name, written in the same elegant, flowing script as all the others, as if she were just another long-dead resident of this impossible, ghostly floor. She stared at the nameplate, her mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. This was not a coincidence. This was not a random detail. This was a message, a sign, a direct and personal address from whatever intelligence governed this strange, silent place. The initial, generalized fear of the unknown began to coalesce into a sharp, specific, and deeply personal terror. This place knew her. It had been waiting for her. The elevator had not malfunctioned. It had been summoned. And she was the one who had answered the call. Her first, primal instinct was to run, to flee back to the elevator, to slam the close door button and pray that it would take her back to the familiar, mundane world of the floors below. But her feet were rooted to the spot, held in place by a powerful, morbid curiosity that was stronger than her fear. She was a journalist. Her entire life was dedicated to uncovering the truth, to shining a light into the dark, hidden corners of the world. And this was the biggest, darkest, and most impossible corner she had ever encountered. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just inches from the cool, tarnished brass of the nameplate. It was her name, but it was also not her name. It was the name of a version of herself that belonged to this place, a version of herself that had lived and, presumably, died in this silent, dust-filled apartment. The thought was a violation, a profound and terrifying twisting of her own identity. She was not just an observer here. She was a part of the exhibit. The sweet, cloying smell of decaying flowers was stronger here, at the end of the hall, as if it were seeping from beneath the door with her name on it. It was a funeral smell, a smell of remembrance and decay. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to know what was on the other side of that door, to see what kind of life this other Elena had lived, to understand how her own name, her own identity, had become entangled in the strange, silent fate of this cursed, forgotten floor. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a powerful, almost reckless sense of journalistic purpose. This was the story. Not the quaint, foolish ramblings of the building's residents, but this. This impossible, tangible, and deeply personal mystery. This was the story that could make her career, the story that could change the very way people understood the world. It was a story that was, quite literally, knocking on her own door. And she knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was exhilarating, that she was going to have to open it. The question was no longer whether the 9th floor was real. The question was whether she would ever be able to leave it. Then, as suddenly as the fear had consumed her, a wave of cold, hard logic washed it away. The initial shock, the primal terror of the unknown, receded, replaced by a familiar and oddly comforting emotion, professional irritation. This wasn't supernatural. It was a prank. An incredibly elaborate, technologically advanced, and meticulously detailed prank, but a prank nonetheless. The absurdity of the situation, when viewed through this new, cynical lens, became not a source of fear, but a source of profound annoyance. Someone was trying to play her for a fool, and Elena did not suffer fools gladly. The theory formed in her mind with a satisfying, click-clack precision. Some enterprising tech startup or immersive theater company had gotten wind of the building's local legend and had decided to capitalize on it. They had created a viral marketing stunt, an experience designed to generate buzz and social media chatter. It was brilliant, in a manipulative, deeply cynical way. They had hacked the elevator's control system, created this staged, theatrical environment, and had somehow, through some form of digital surveillance, managed to get her name and apartment number to add a personalized, deeply unsettling touch. She even found herself grudgingly admiring the scale of the operation. Renting an entire floor, or perhaps just building a convincing set within an abandoned section of the building. redecorating it in this Gothic, vaguely historical style. Custom fabricating the brass nameplates. Even the dead phone was a classic trope of the genre, a cheap but effective way to heighten the sense of isolation. It was a masterful piece of stagecraft, a perfectly executed immersive attraction. And she had walked right into the middle of it, a lone audience member in a play that had been designed just for her. The fear was completely gone now, replaced by a steely, journalistic resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a critic. She would not be manipulated by their cheap, theatrical tricks. She would expose them. She would write an article, not about the building's ghost, but about the new, insidious forms of viral marketing, about the way companies were now willing to exploit people's fears and invade their privacy for the sake of a clever ad campaign. The story had shifted, and she was back in control of the narrative. She walked back down the silent, dusty corridor, her steps no longer hesitant, but firm and confident. She was not a trespasser in a ghostly realm, she was an investigative journalist on a new and unexpected beat. She reached the door with her name on it, the centerpiece of their little psychodrama, and she raised her hand. She was not going to cower in fear. She was going to confront them. She was going to knock on the door, and when they opened it, expecting to see a terrified, screaming woman, they would see a calm, professional journalist with a few very pointed questions. She knocked, a series of 3 sharp, authoritative raps that echoed in the profound silence of the hallway. The sound was a challenge, a declaration that she was not afraid, that she was onto their game. She stood back, crossed her arms, and waited, a small, ironic smile on her face. She was ready for the actor who would open the door, ready for the hidden cameras, ready for the whole, elaborate reveal. She could already picture a team of young, trendy tech brothers high-fiving each other in a control room somewhere, watching her on a monitor. But the door remained closed. The silence that answered her knock was as absolute and unnerving as the silence that had preceded it. There was no sound of movement from within the apartment, no muffled whispers, no footsteps approaching the door. There was nothing. Just the same heavy, expectant stillness, the same faint, cloying smell of decaying flowers. She knocked again, harder this time, her knuckles rapping sharply against the dark, heavy wood. Still nothing. The prank was beginning to lose its charm, her irritation now tinged with a growing impatience. She waited for a full minute, her ears straining for any sign of life from within the apartment. The silence was unwavering. It was beginning to feel less like a deliberate, theatrical pause and more like a genuine, profound emptiness. The confidence she had felt just moments before began to waver, a small, cold splinter of the original, primal fear beginning to work its way back under her skin. What if she was wrong? What if this wasn't a prank? What if there was no one on the other side of the door because this place was exactly what it appeared to be, a silent, empty, and very real tomb? She shook her head, physically dispelling the irrational thought. She would not allow herself to be drawn back into their narrative. The silence was part of the act, designed to unnerve her, to make her doubt her own rational conclusions. It was a classic horror trope, the unanswered knock, the silent, waiting menace. They were good, she had to admit. They knew what they were doing. But she would not play along. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her scared. If they wouldn't come to her, she would simply leave. She turned her back on the door with her name on it, a final, dismissive gesture. She would not be writing an exposé on their clever marketing campaign. She would not be writing anything at all. To write about this experience, to give it any kind of journalistic legitimacy, would be to play right into their hands. It would be giving them exactly the free publicity they so desperately craved. The story was dead. She would bury it, file it away under unsubstantiated urban legend, and move on to a real story, a story with facts and sources and a verifiable, tangible reality. She walked back to the elevator, its doors still standing open, a silent, waiting portal back to the world she understood. She stepped inside, the familiar, graffiti-scarred walls a welcome, comforting sight after the oppressive, faux Gothic elegance of the hallway. She did not look back. She pressed the button for the ground floor, and this time, the elevator responded instantly. The doors slid shut with a smooth, satisfying thud, the strange, spiral symbol on the indicator panel was replaced by the familiar, comforting number 1, and the cab began its smooth, uneventful descent. As the elevator moved, she felt a profound sense of relief, the feeling of a swimmer breaking the surface after being held underwater for too long. The air in the cab seemed fresher, easier to breathe. The normal, mechanical sounds of the elevator were a reassuring symphony of rationality. The 9th floor, with its dusty wallpaper and its silent, waiting doors, already felt like a distant, half-remembered dream. She had been right all along. It was just a story. A clever, technologically advanced story, but a story nonetheless. And she was a journalist who dealt in facts, not fiction. She stepped out into the dingy, familiar lobby of the ground floor, the late afternoon sun now streaming through the grimy windows. The building was just a building again, a sad, neglected block of concrete and peeling paint. The curse was broken, the magic dispelled by the bright, unforgiving light of day. She walked out the front door and didn't look back, her mind already moving on to the next assignment, the next deadline. She was firmly, and gratefully, back in the real world, and she was determined to forget the strange, unsettling detour she had taken into the realm of the city's most elaborate and convincing urban legend. A week passed. The memory of the cursed high-rise, which had seemed so vivid and unsettling in the moment, began to fade, eroded away by the relentless tide of deadlines and new assignments. Elena had already submitted a piece on municipal corruption, a solid, fact-based story that was much more her style. The strange, dusty corridor and the door with her name on it had receded into the back of her mind, becoming a strange, half-forgotten anecdote, a story she might tell at a party someday to illustrate the bizarre lengths people will go to for a clever marketing stunt. She had successfully, and willfully, forgotten about the urban legend. On Friday morning, an email appeared in the main editorial inbox. It had no subject line and no sender, from a field a random, meaningless jumble of letters and numbers. It was the kind of email that would normally be deleted without a second thought, another piece of digital junk mail destined for the trash. But the editor, a man with a journalist's ingrained and often unrewarded curiosity, was having a slow morning. He opened it. The email contained no text, no message, just a single, unlabeled audio file attachment. Intrigued, he downloaded it. He double-clicked the file, and the speakers on his computer crackled to life. The audio quality was terrible, a wall of static and hiss, as if it had been recorded on a cheap, damaged device. But through the noise, a voice could be heard. It was a woman's voice, distorted and tinny, but it was filled with a raw, undiluted panic that was instantly, chillingly recognizable. It was a voice that was familiar to everyone in the newsroom. It was Elena's voice. But it was a version of her voice they had never heard before, a voice stripped of its usual calm, professional confidence and reduced to a primal, animalistic terror. The voice was ragged, torn by frantic, hysterical sobs. It was choking on a mixture of panic and tears, the words tumbling out in a desperate, almost incoherent stream. It was a voice from the very edge of sanity, a voice from the heart of a nightmare. The words it spoke were a desperate, frantic plea, a prayer directed at an unseen and unheard listener. The voice was begging, pleading, imploring someone, something, on the other side of a barrier to remain silent. It was a plea for a secret to be kept, a secret that was a matter of life and death. "Please," the voice on the recording cried, the sound warped and stretched by the static, "don't tell them. Don't tell anyone about the wrong floor." The phrase was repeated over and over, a desperate, broken mantra. "They'll never let me out if they know you were here. They'll never let me go back." The voice was not coming from a phone or a radio. It was the raw, unmediated sound of a person screaming in a small, enclosed space, the words echoing slightly, as if they were bouncing off the hard, metallic walls of an elevator. It was the voice of a prisoner, a captive, begging a witness to forget what they had seen. The editor sat frozen at his desk, his hand hovering over the mouse, his face a mask of confusion and disbelief. The other journalists in the open-plan office had stopped their work, their heads turning toward the source of the disturbing sound. They all recognized the voice. They all heard the raw, naked terror in it. It was a joke, someone muttered. A prank. Elena was known for a dry, cynical sense of humor. This had to be some kind of elaborate, in-house gag. But the fear in the voice was too real, too convincing. It was not the sound of an actor. It was the sound of genuine, soul-shattering horror. The recording ended as abruptly as it had begun, cutting off mid-plea, leaving only the sound of hissing static, which then faded into an absolute, profound silence. The newsroom was still, the usual morning buzz of keyboards and phone calls replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. Everyone was looking at Elena's empty desk. She had called in sick that morning, a rare occurrence for a journalist who prided herself on her perfect attendance record. The editor tried her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. A cold, unsettling feeling began to spread through the office, a collective, unspoken fear that was far more potent than any urban legend. And from that day forward, something in the building changed. Their new, modern, and technologically advanced office building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel, had always been a place of perfect, predictable logic. Its elevators were silent, swift, and unfailingly accurate. But now, they had started to develop a strange, inexplicable quirk. Sometimes, for no reason at all, the elevator would make an unscheduled stop. It would slow down, the doors would chime, and the small, digital display above the door, which was supposed to show a number from 1 to 8, would instead, for a brief, flickering moment, display a 9. The doors would never open on this phantom floor. The elevator would just pause there for a long, silent moment, as if waiting for a passenger who never arrived, before continuing on its journey. At first, it was a source of jokes, a funny little glitch that people would talk about by the coffee machine. They called it Elena's floor, a playful nod to the strange, disturbing audio file that had become a piece of newsroom folklore. But the jokes soon died down, replaced by a quiet, shared unease. No one took the stairs, but no one rode the elevator alone anymore, either. The building had 8 floors. Everyone knew that. But sometimes, in the silent, humming space between the 8th and the roof, the machine seemed to remember a floor that the architects had somehow forgotten to include in the plans.